Hello everyone, welcome back again to our class. So today we will continue our discussion about becoming a member of society. So we will talk today what is human dignity and human rights. But before that, let's define first what is human dignity. So human dignity refers to the idea that a person has the innate right to be valued. So what is this? So according to Daniel Darling, the author of The Dignity Revolution, human dignity is the idea of human being that born regardless with the utility, regardless with the station in life, with the class, with the giftedness, with the talent, or how much we proceed or contribute, that every human being has a value and worth. So if we believe in human dignity, we believe also to ourselves, and we are not just perceive ourselves, but we designed with a purpose by our Creator. So when we look on it, it is also a self-value that cannot be taken away, with great respect and purpose, not only with ourselves, but with other people as well. So what about human rights? So human rights are founded on natural rights, which are universal and inalienable, and are not contingent on laws, on customs, on beliefs, or values of particular culture. So these human rights is our blueprint where no one could steal because it was already imposed. So it will protect us from severe political, from legal and social abuses. So human rights are simply a set of moral values and or principles that are attributed to an individual regardless of ethnicity, regardless of gender or age. So the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on December 1948, which created the articles that aimed at restoring dignity and respect for human lives. So now, let's look and listen to a short clip that I will be given to you, regardless with human rights and its characteristics.
The idea of human rights is that each one of us, no matter who we are or where we are born, is entitled to the same basic rights and freedoms. Human rights are not privileges, and they cannot be granted or revoked. They are inalienable and universal. That may sound straightforward enough, but it gets incredibly complicated as soon as anyone tries to put the idea into practice. What exactly are the basic human rights? Who gets to pick them? Who enforces them, and how? The history behind the concept of human rights is a long one. Throughout the centuries and across societies, religions, and cultures, we have struggled with defining notions of rightfulness, justice, and rights. But one of the most modern affirmations of universal human rights emerged from the ruins of World War II with the creation of the United Nations. The treaty that established the UN gives as one of its purposes to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. And with the same spirit, in 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This document, written by an international committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, lays the basis for modern international human rights law. The Declaration is based on the principle that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It lists 30 articles recognizing, among other things, the principle of non-discrimination and the right to life and liberty. It refers to negative freedoms, like the freedom from torture or slavery, as well as positive freedoms, such as the freedom of movement and residence. It encompasses basic civil and political rights, such as freedom of expression, religion, or peaceful assembly, as well as social, economic, and cultural rights, such as the right to education and the right to freely choose one's occupation and be paid and treated fairly. The Declaration takes no sides as to which rights are more important, insisting on their universality, indivisibility, and interdependence. And in the past decades, international human rights law has grown, deepening and expanding our understanding of what human rights are and how to better protect them. So if these principles are so well developed, then why are human rights abused and ignored time and time again all over the world? The problem, in general, is that it is not at all easy to universally enforce these rights or to punish transgressors. The UDHR itself, despite being highly authoritative and respected, is a declaration, not a hard law. So when individual countries violate it, the mechanisms to address those violations are weak. For example, the main bodies within the UN in charge of protecting human rights mostly monitor and investigate violations, but they cannot force states to, say, change a policy or compensate a victim. That's why some critics say it's naive to consider human rights a given in a world where state interests wield so much power. Critics also question the universality of human rights and emphasize that their development has been heavily guided by a small number of mostly Western nations, to the detriment of inclusiveness. The result? A general bias in favor of civil political liberties over socio-political rights, and of individual over collective or groups' rights. Others defend universal human rights laws and point at the positive role they have on setting international standards and helping activists in their campaigns. They also point out that not all international human rights instruments are powerless. For example, the European Convention on Human Rights establishes a court where the 47 member countries and their citizens can bring cases. The court issues binding decisions that each member state must comply with. Human rights law is constantly evolving, as are our views and definitions of what the basic human rights should be. For example, how basic or important is the right to democracy or to development? And as our lives are increasingly digital, should there be a right to access the internet? A right to digital privacy? What do you think?
So the fight for human dignity and rights did not end after the Declaration. Despite having been supported by 48 countries where 8 abstained, the Declaration was just symbolic, as it did not have any legal authority. It all changed in 1976 when it was ratified and became an international law for all member states which signed the document. So currently, there are further clamor to push for the human rights agenda to countries which questionable records. So in reality, many of the rights stipulated in the Declaration are under threat, most significantly in some developing countries where human rights education is mostly limited and human rights values are not yet translated through local laws. So another layer the Universal Declaration is trying to overcome is the lack of political will from countries which have different worldviews and values that do not coincide with the Declaration. So many of these nations come from oppressive regimes or dictatorships. So regardless of the challenges that lie ahead, the United Nations serve humanity by advancing its agenda toward and making human rights truly a universal norm. So that's all for today. So I hope you learned something from this lesson. Thank you so much for listening, and that's all for the becoming member of society. So stay home, stay safe, and God bless everyone.